long before the first Spanish boots pressed into the soil of the Americas, long before the glint of foreign steel caught the equatorial sun. There existed a world that needed no discovery. It was a world of mist-shrouded peaks and emerald valleys, of rivers that carved their way through mountains like the slow breath of time itself, to the high plateaus of what we now call Colombia, where the air grows thin and the clouds descend to walk among the living. A civilization flourished in quiet splendor. They called themselves the Muisca, and they held secrets that would one day drive men to madness. The Muisca were not empire builders in the fashion of their distant cousins, the Inca, whose roads stretched like veins across the body of a continent. Nor were they monument makers like the Maya, whose pyramids rose to challenge the heavens. The Muisca built something more subtle, more enduring in its own way. They built a society woven from trade and ritual, from the careful cultivation of highland crops and the even more careful cultivation of the sacred. Their confederation spread across the fertile basins of the eastern Andes, a patchwork of chiefdoms bound not by conquest, but by commerce, marriage, and shared reverence for forces that dwelt beyond the visible world. Gold came to the Muisca, not through violence, but through patience. They were not miners who tore open the earth in search of yellow metal. Instead, they were traders who received gold, dust, and nuggets from neighboring peoples, carrying it up from the lowland rivers where it gathered in the sediment like fallen starlight. In their skilled hands, this raw material became something else entirely. Goldsmiths developed techniques of breathtaking sophistication, creating objects that seemed to capture light itself within their forms. They mastered the lost wax method, casting intricate figures that depicted humans, animals, and beings that belonged to neither category. They learned to alloy gold with copper to create tembaga, a metal that could be treated with plant acids to draw pure gold to its surface, creating objects that blazed with brilliance while conserving the precious material within. But here lies the first and most important truth about the Muisca and their gold, a truth that the arriving Europeans would never truly grasp. To the Muisca, gold held no monetary value. It could not be spent or hoarded as wealth in the way that foreign minds would later imagine. Gold was sacred. Gold was communication. Gold was the means by which mortal beings spoke to the divine forces that govern rain and harvest, health and misfortune, the turning of seasons and the passage of souls. When a Muisca craftsman shaped gold into a votive figure, he was not creating currency or even art in the way we might understand it. He was creating a prayer made solid, a message intended for recipients who dwelt beyond the realm of flesh and bone. Among all the sacred places in Muisca territory, none held greater significance than the lakes. These bodies of water, nestled in the craters of ancient volcanoes and the depressions of the highland plateau, were considered doorways. They were liminal spaces where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits grew thin enough to cross. The lakes were feminine, associated with the moon and with the great mother goddess who had emerged from the waters at the beginning of time, carrying the future of humanity in her arms. To approach a sacred lake was to approach the divine feminine itself, and such approaches demanded ritual, sacrifice, and profound respect. The lake that would become most famous sat in a nearly perfect circular crater, its waters dark and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror made of obsidian. The Spanish would later call it Guatavita, and around this lake, they would weave stories that would echo through centuries. But before it had a Spanish name, before it became synonymous with impossible wealth, Lake Guatavita was simply one of the holiest sites in Muisca cosmology. It was here that chieftains were consecrated. It was here that the most powerful offerings were made. It was here that a ritual took place that would ignite imaginations across an ocean and spawn one of history's most destructive obsessions. The ceremony began in darkness. A new chief, a man chosen to lead one of the Muisca communities, would be stripped of all clothing and all identity. His body would be covered with a sticky resin, and then, with careful hands, attendants would blow gold dust across every surface of his skin until he gleamed like a figure cast from the metal itself. He became, in that moment, not a man, but a symbol, a living offering, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, this golden figure would be placed upon a raft constructed of reeds. Around him, priests and nobles took their positions. The raft was loaded with offerings, gold figurines, emeralds, ceramic vessels filled with sacred substances. Torches blazed. Music rose from the shore where the gathered people watched and sang. The raft pushed out onto the still waters of the lake. In the growing light, the gold-covered chief must have seemed like a piece of the sun itself, floating upon the dark mirror of the water. When the raft reached the center of the lake, the ceremony reached its climax. The chief began to wash the gold from his body, letting the sacred dust drift down into the depths. The offerings were cast overboard, gold and emeralds tumbling into the darkness to be received by the spirits below. The water closed over treasures beyond counting, and the chief emerged from his ablutions transformed, no longer golden, but now fully invested with the spiritual authority to lead his people. He had given everything to the lake and had received in return a power that no amount of gold could purchase. This ritual, or variations of it, had taken place for generations before any European learned of its existence. The lake bottom accumulated centuries of offerings, layer upon layer of sacred objects sinking into the soft mud, each one a prayer, a petition, a thanksgiving. The Muisca did not think of this accumulation as treasure. They thought of it as a relationship, the ongoing conversation between their people and the forces that sustained them. When drought threatened, offerings went to the lake. When illness spread, offerings went to the lake. When a chief died and a new one rose to take his place, the most elaborate offerings of all went to the lake. The water held not wealth, but faith made tangible. The first Spanish conquistadors arrived in Muisca territory in 1537, led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. They came from the Caribbean coast, having hacked their way through lowland jungles and climbed the brutal eastern slopes of the Andes in search of a route to Peru and its legendary riches. What they found instead was the Muisca Confederation, a civilization that possessed gold in quantities that made Spanish hearts race. But these first conquistadors, focused on immediate plunder and the establishment of colonial control, did not yet understand the full significance of what they had stumbled upon. They seized gold objects, demanded tribute, founded the city of Bogotá on the site of a Muisca settlement, and set about the grim business of conquest. The story of the golden ritual at the lake reached them as rumor, as whisper, as one among many tales of indigenous custom that they catalogued without fully comprehending. It was in the years that followed, as Spanish control spread and deepened, that the story of the Golden Chief began to grow. Colonial administrators and chroniclers collected indigenous accounts, questioning Muisca elders about their traditions and their history. The story of the lake ceremony was told and retold, each telling adding weight and wonder. The Spanish gave the Golden Chief a name, or rather, a title. They called him El Dorado, the Gilded One. In their language, the term captured the essential image of that gold-dusted figure floating upon the sacred waters at dawn. El Dorado was, in its original meaning, a person, a priest-king who transformed himself into an offering of living gold. But something strange happens to stories when they travel, especially when they travel through minds already fevered with gold lust. The Spanish had conquered the Aztec Empire and stripped it of treasures that had taken centuries to accumulate. They had overthrown the Inca and claimed the ransom room of Atahualpa, gold piled to the height of a raised hand. These conquests had proven that the Americas held wealth beyond European imagination, and that wealth was there for the taking if one possessed sufficient courage, cruelty, and luck. Every conquistador who had not yet made his fortune believed that somewhere, Beyond the next mountain range or past the next river lay another empire waiting to be plundered, another treasury waiting to be claimed. In this atmosphere of desperate hope and bottomless greed, El Dorado began to transform. The Gilded One became the Golden Place. The ritual became the city. Whispered accounts of a chief covered in gold dust became legends of a kingdom where gold was as common as stone, where the streets themselves were paved with the precious metal, where temples blazed with treasures that dwarfed even the wonders of Tenochtitlan and Cusco. El Dorado ceased to be a man and became a destination, a city, a kingdom, an empire of gold hidden somewhere in the vast and unmapped interior of South America. The transformation was complete, and the hunt was about to begin. The geography of rumor is always vague, always shifting. As the legend of El Dorado grew, its supposed location wandered across the map. Some said it lay in the mountains of Colombia, not far from where the original Muisca ritual had taken place. Others insisted it must be found in the steaming lowlands to the east, in the endless forests that stretched toward a horizon no European had yet reached. Still others placed it to the south, conflating it with Inca legends of a kingdom called Patiti, or with rumors of cities in the Amazon basin. The very uncertainty of its location became part of El Dorado's power. It could be anywhere, which meant it could be everywhere, which meant that any expedition into unknown territory might be the one that finally found it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and terrible episodes in the history of human exploration. For more than a century, expedition after expedition set out in search of El Dorado. They departed from the coasts of Venezuela and Colombia, from the newly conquered cities of Peru and Ecuador, from the settlements springing up along the great rivers of the interior. They plunged into jungles that swallowed them whole. They climbed mountains that broke them. They followed rivers that led nowhere or everywhere, depending on which rumor they believed. They died of disease, starvation, drowning, poisoned arrows, and each other. They killed indigenous peoples by the thousands, sometimes in battle, more often through enslavement and the diseases that traveled with European bodies. And they never found El Dorado, because El Dorado, the city of gold, had never existed. The original truth was so much smaller and so much more beautiful. Chief, covered in gold dust, offering himself to the sacred waters of a mountain lake, a civilization that valued gold not for what it could buy, but for what it could say. A relationship between humans and the divine, maintained through centuries of careful ritual. This truth was not enough for the men who came from across the ocean. They needed more. They needed El Dorado to be a city, an empire, a fortune beyond counting. And because they needed it so badly, they made it real in their minds, and in pursuing that phantom, they remade the world in blood and fire. The mist still gathers over the mountains of Colombia, and the waters of ancient lakes still hold their secrets. Somewhere beneath the surface of Guatavita, gold offerings rest in the mud, prayers that were answered or unanswered, we cannot know. The Muisca are still here, their descendants walking the same highlands, carrying forward what remains of traditions that survived conquest and colonization. They remember what gold truly meant, even if the world forgot. They know that the real El Dorado was never a place to be found. It was a moment to be experienced, a transformation to be undergone, a gift to be given, rather than a treasure to be taken. But in the 16th century, none of this mattered to the men preparing their expeditions. The legend was loose in the world, and it demanded to be pursued. Ships were provisioned. Soldiers were recruited. Prayers were said to saints who watched over treasure seekers. And one by one, the expeditions set forth into the green unknown, chasing a golden phantom that retreated, always just beyond reach, leading them deeper and deeper into landscapes that would claim most of them and release only stories, only rumors, only the ever-growing legend of the city that was never there. The year 1541 found the Spanish Empire at the height of its conquering fever. 2 decades had passed since Hernan Cortes had brought the Aztec Empire to its knees, and less than 10 years since Francisco Pizarro had done the same to the Inca. The treasures extracted from these civilizations had flooded back to Spain, transforming a kingdom on the edge of Europe into the wealthiest power the world had ever seen. Gold and silver flowed through the ports of Seville like water, financing wars, building palaces, and igniting an inflation that would reshape European economics for generations. But for the men on the ground in the Americas, the men who had watched others grow rich while they remained poor, the great conquests were finished. The empires were fallen. The easy gold was gone. What remained was the tantalizing possibility that somewhere in the vast unmapped interior, another empire waited. Another treasury lay unguarded. Another El Dorado shimmered just beyond the horizon. Gonzalo Pizarro was a man who understood both the rewards and the costs of conquest. He was the younger half-brother of Francisco, and he had been present at the capture of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, had witnessed the room filled with gold that purchased nothing but a death sentence for the last free ruler of the Andes. Gonzalo had received his share of that treasure, but shares divide and diminish, and younger brothers must make their own fortunes. By 1541, he had been appointed governor of Quito, the northern reaches of the former Inca realm, and from this position he gazed eastward toward the mountains and the rumored lands beyond. The stories had reached him as they reached everyone in those years. Somewhere to the east lay a land of cinnamon trees, spices that might rival the wealth of the Indies. And beyond that, perhaps, lay El Dorado itself. Gonzalo assembled an expedition of staggering ambition. More than 200 Spanish soldiers joined him, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, men hardened by violence and desperate for the wealth that had eluded them. Alongside these Europeans marched approximately 4,000 indigenous people, pressed into service as porters and laborers, their lives valued only for the burdens they could carry. The expedition brought with it thousands of pigs and llamas for food, packs of hunting dogs trained to track and kill, horses that had proven their worth in the conquest of empires. They carried weapons, tools, supplies for months of travel, in the unshakable conviction that riches awaited them. In February of that year, its enormous column began its descent from the high plateau of Quito into the cloud forests of the eastern Andes. The mountains fought them from the first day. The trails, such as they existed, had been made by indigenous peoples who traveled light and knew every handhold. For the Spanish column, burdened with equipment and animals, the descent became a continuous catastrophe. Paths crumbled beneath the weight of horses. Pigs tumbled into ravines. Men lost their footing and fell screaming into mist-filled voids. The cloud forest wrapped around them, soaking them with moisture that never dried, chilling them even as they descended toward the equatorial lowlands. Disease found them quickly, fevers that burned through the ranks and left the dead to be buried in shallow graves or simply abandoned where they fell. The indigenous porters suffered most of all, forced to carry loads meant for pack animals through terrain that would challenge an unencumbered climber. They collapsed by the hundreds. Those who could not continue were left behind, which meant death in a landscape that offered no mercy to the weak. Those who tried to flee were hunted down by the Spanish dogs, animals bred for war and trained to find human prey. The column that had departed Quito so grandly grew smaller with each passing week, shedding lives the way a wounded animal sheds blood, marking its passage with a trail of corpses. When they finally descended into the lowlands, the jungle received them without welcome. This was the Amazon basin, though no European had yet given it that name. It was a world of water and green, of rivers that spread into marshes and marshes that deepened into rivers, of trees so tall that their canopies formed a second sky, blocking out the sun and trapping the humidity in a perpetual steam. The ground was rarely solid. The air was thick with insects that bit and burrowed and carried diseases for which Spanish medicine had no name. The cinnamon trees they sought existed, but scattered and sparse. Nothing like the concentrated groves they had imagined. There would be no spice fortune here. Among Gonzalo Pizarro's officers was a man named Francisco de Orellana. He was a distant cousin of the Pizarro brothers, a veteran conquistador who had lost an eye in some previous campaign, a one-eyed man searching for a golden city in a green hill. As the expedition bogged down in the jungle, as supplies dwindled and starvation began to thin the ranks further, a decision was made that would shape history. The expedition had reached a river, a tributary of larger waters that flowed toward the unknown east. Orellana was ordered to take a small group of men, build a boat, and travel downstream in search of food in the rumored wealthy lands that indigenous captives spoke of, perhaps under torture, perhaps simply telling their captors what they wanted to hear. Orellana departed with perhaps 50 men in a hastily constructed brigantine. The plan was simple: find supplies, find the wealthy kingdom, return to the main expedition. But rivers in the Amazon flow only one direction, and the current that carried Orellana away from Pizarro was stronger than any Spanish intention. Days passed, then weeks. The river joined larger rivers. The current grew more powerful. To turn back would have meant rowing against a flow that would have exhausted the strongest men within hours. Orellana and his men found themselves committed to a journey they had not planned, carried by waters that would not let them return. Behind them, Gonzalo Pizarro waited. He waited until waiting became impossible, till starvation forced him to begin the long retreat back toward Quito. The expedition that had departed with such confidence now stumbled homeward as a column of ghosts. The thousands of indigenous porters were almost all dead. The Spanish soldiers who survived were skeletal, fevered, many of them walking barefoot because their boots had rotted away in the endless moisture. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then their belts, and the leather of their saddles. They ate whatever they could find, and many of them died anyway. When Gonzalo Pizarro finally reached Quito, he returned with fewer than 80% of the men who had departed with him. He had found no cinnamon, no gold, no El Dorado. He had found only the indifferent cruelty of a landscape that owed nothing to Spanish dreams. But Orellana was still on the river. For months, the small band of Spaniards drifted and paddled and sailed eastward, following the flow of water that grew ever wider, ever more powerful. They passed through territories belonging to peoples who had never seen Europeans, some of whom attacked them, and some of whom offered food and shelter. They learned to read the river, to find channels that would carry them forward, to avoid the submerged logs and sandbars that could destroy their fragile craft. They repaired their boat when they could and built new ones when they had to, cutting timber from the endless forest and fashioning it into vessels that could survive the journey. The indigenous peoples they encountered spoke of many things. They spoke of wealthy tribes, upriver and downriver, of settlements where food was abundant, of warriors who would defend their lands. The Spanish interpreted everything through the lens of their obsession. Every mention of a powerful chief became evidence of a king. Every description of a prosperous village became a hint of El Dorado. And, somewhere along the river, they encountered something that would give the waterway its lasting name. The accounts speak of a battle with warriors who fought with unusual ferocity, and among these warriors, the Spanish claimed to see women, tall women with long hair, fighting alongside the men, or perhaps leading them, wielding bows with deadly accuracy. Whether these were actually female warriors, or whether the long-haired men of certain indigenous groups were misidentified in the chaos of combat, or whether the Spanish simply needed to see what they expected to see, remains unknown. But the conquistadors knew their classical mythology. They knew the stories of the Amazons, the legendary tribe of warrior women who had fought against the heroes of Greek legend. And so they gave the river a name that it carries to this day. A name born from European imagination projected onto South American reality. Orellana and his men emerged from the mouth of the Amazon in August of 1542. More than a year and a half after departing Quito, they had traveled nearly 4,000 miles, becoming the first Europeans to navigate the entire length of the greatest river system on Earth. They had survived starvation, disease, combat, and the sheer overwhelming scale of a landscape that reduced human beings to insignificance. They had not found El Dorado. They had not found anything that would make them wealthy. But they had accomplished something that, in a different age, might have been celebrated as one of the great feats of exploration. Instead, Orellana returned to Spain to face accusations of treachery from Gonzalo Pizarro, who claimed that his officer had deliberately abandoned the main expedition. Orellana defended himself, argued his case, and eventually received permission to return to the Amazon and establish a colony. He departed Spain in 1545 with a new expedition, dreaming perhaps of finding what had eluded him the first time. The river that had once carried him to survival now destroyed him. Orellana died somewhere in a delta of disease or starvation or simple exhaustion. And his second expedition dissolved into the jungle that had already consumed so many European dreams. He was buried in an unmarked grave, if he was buried at all, and the Amazon continued to flow as it had always flowed, indifferent to the ambitions that had briefly troubled its waters. The failure of the Pizarro-Orellana expedition did nothing to diminish the legend of El Dorado. If anything, the very scale of the disaster seemed to confirm that great treasures must lie hidden in those murderous lands. Why else would the jungle guard itself so ferociously? Why else would the rivers twist and turn to confuse the seeker? The logic of gold fever is not rational logic. It is the logic of the gambler who has lost everything and believes that the next bet will redeem all previous losses. The Spanish had invested too much blood and suffering in the search for El Dorado to abandon it now. To give up would be to admit that the deaths had been meaningless, that the treasure had never existed, that the greatest empire on earth had been chasing shadows. So the expeditions continued. From the coastal settlements of Venezuela, from the mountain cities of Colombia, from the river ports of the Amazon, men continued to set forth in search of the Golden City. Each expedition learned from the failures of those before it, and each expedition found new ways to fail. They mapped rivers that led nowhere. They climbed mountains that hid nothing, tortured indigenous peoples for information about wealthy kingdoms and the indigenous peoples. Seeking to end their suffering, pointed always to somewhere else, somewhere further, somewhere beyond the next range of hills. El Dorado retreated endlessly before its pursuers, horizon that could never be reached because it existed only in the minds of those who sought it. The human cost of these expeditions is impossible to calculate with any precision. Thousands of Spanish soldiers died, certainly, but their deaths were recorded and mourned by someone somewhere. The indigenous peoples who died as porters, guides, slaves, and victims of violence numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions if one counts the epidemics that spread ahead of the expeditions. It's continued to spread long after they had passed. Entire cultures were disrupted or destroyed. Languages were lost. Knowledge that had accumulated over millennia vanished with the elders who held it. The search for El Dorado was not merely a failed treasure hunt. It was a catastrophe that reshaped the human geography of South America. Yet the legend only grew. As the 16th century progressed, El Dorado became less a specific place and more a general concept, a shorthand for the wealth that must exist somewhere in the Americas. Absorbed other legends, absorbed other rumors, became a repository for every hope and fantasy that Europeans projected onto the New World. City of Gold was said to lie beside a great lake called Parimé. It was said to be ruled by a descendant of the Inca, who had fled the Spanish conquest with his people and their treasures. It was said to contain temples that put the wonders of the old world to shame. None of these things were true, but truth had long since become irrelevant. What mattered was the dream, the possibility, the golden light that flickered always just out of reach. The Muisca, whose ritual had started everything, had largely been conquered and converted by this time. Their sacred lakes had been identified and investigated. Crude attempts to drain Lake Guatavita had begun. Efforts to recover the offerings that centuries of ceremony had deposited in its depths. But the gold that emerged was disappointing. Small offerings from a people who had valued quality over quantity, spirituality over ostentation. This was not the treasure hoard of an empire. This was the accumulated prayer of generations, and it could not satisfy appetites that had grown to imperial scale. The 16th century drew toward its close, and El Dorado remained unfound. The Spanish Empire had grown rich beyond measure, but that wealth came from silver mines in Peru and Mexico, not from golden cities in the jungle. The conquistadors who had dreamed of finding the next Tenochtitlan died one by one, some in battle, some in disease, some simply of old age. Their dreams unfulfilled, new generations took their place, but the fever was beginning to cool. Other concerns demanded attention. The empire had to be administered, defended, exploited through means more systematic than treasure hunting. El Dorado was becoming a legend rather than a destination, a story told to children rather than a goal pursued by men. But legends do not die so easily. Even as Spanish enthusiasm waned, other nations were beginning to look westward with hungry eyes. The English, the Dutch, the French, all of them had heard the stories of El Dorado, and all of them wondered whether the Spanish had simply looked in the wrong places. The city of gold was still out there, waiting, and perhaps it would take different eyes to find it. The next chapter of the search was about to begin, and it would be written in English. In the tangled history of the El Dorado obsession, there exists a chapter so strange that it seems almost invented. A tale of German bankers and German soldiers pursuing Spanish dreams in the jungles of South America. Yet it is entirely true, and it represents one of the most brutal and least remembered episodes in the long search for the city of gold. This is the story of the Welser expeditions, and it begins not in the Americas, but in the counting houses of Augsburg, where money and power intertwined in ways that would send ripples across an ocean. The Welser family was one of the great banking dynasties of 16th century Europe. Along with their rivals and sometime partners, the Fuggers, they had accumulated wealth that could make or break kingdoms. They financed wars, underwrote trading expeditions, cooed and lent money to monarchs who found their ambitions outstripping their treasuries. Among their most prominent clients was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, a ruler whose domains stretched across Europe and into the Americas, but whose coffers were perpetually empty. Charles needed money for his endless wars against France, against the Ottoman Turks, against the Protestant princes of Germany. The Welsers had money, and so a deal was struck that would have seemed fantastic in any other age. In 1528, Charles V granted the Welser family the right to colonize and exploit a vast territory on the northern coast of South America. This land, which the Spanish called Venezuela, meaning Little Venice, had been explored but not effectively colonized. It was known to be difficult terrain, a combination of coastal lowlands, inland plains called llanos, and the northern fingers of the Andes Mountains. It was also rumored to be rich in gold. The Welsers would have the right to explore, to settle, to trade, and to keep the majority of whatever wealth they found. In exchange, they would open the territory to German settlement, establish towns, and extend Spanish imperial claims into regions that Spanish colonists had been reluctant to enter. It was an extraordinary arrangement. A German banking family, motivated by profit rather than glory, would send German soldiers and administrators to conquer and exploit a Spanish colonial territory. The enterprise was commercial from its inception, a venture capital operation dressed in the armor of conquest. The Welsers were not interested in spreading Christianity or extending civilization. They were interested in return on investment. They wanted gold, and they were prepared to spend lives, both German and indigenous, to find it. The first Welser governor of Venezuela was Ambrosius in Hunger, sometimes called Ambrosio Alfinger in the Spanish sources. He arrived in 1529 with several hundred German and Spanish soldiers and immediately began probing the interior in search of wealth. Ihinger was a hard man in a hard business, and he brought to the task a methodical cruelty that would characterize the Welser expeditions. He marched his men into the highlands, following rumors of golden kingdoms, torturing indigenous peoples for information, slaving those who might be useful, and killing those who were not. The pattern was familiar from Spanish conquests elsewhere, but Ihinger pursued it with a cold efficiency that even veterans of those campaigns found remarkable. The land resisted him at every turn. Stellanos, those vast interior plains, became impassable swamps during the rainy season and baked into cracked hardpan during the dry months. The rivers were unpredictable, flooding without warning or shrinking to trickles that could not support an expedition. Disease was constant. The indigenous peoples, once they understood what the newcomers intended, either fled into regions the Europeans could not follow or fought with desperate courage. Hunger pushed forward anyway, driven by the same conviction that had driven Pizarro and would drive so many others. The gold must be there. It must be just ahead. One more march, one more river crossing, one more mountain pass. In 1533, after years of brutal campaigning that had achieved nothing but suffering, Ambrosius Ihinger was killed. An indigenous arrow found him during a skirmish, and he died in the wilderness he had tried so hard to plunder. His men carried his body back to the coast, and the Welsers sent another governor to replace him. The enterprise continued because the enterprise had to continue. Too much had been invested to abandon the venture now. The logic of sunk costs, which had driven so many El Dorado expeditions, was if anything stronger for a banking family that calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. The next significant Welser expedition was led by Nicolaus Federmann, a man whose ambition matched his capacity for endurance. Federmann departed from the Venezuelan coast in 1536 with a force that included both Germans and Spaniards, and he struck out into the interior with the declared intention of finding the wealthy kingdoms that Ihinger had failed to locate. His route took him south and west, across the Llanos and into the foothills of the Andes, through territories where no European had previously traveled. The expedition lasted 3 years and covered thousands of miles, and it found nothing that could be called treasure. What Federmann did find was the same thing that every El Dorado seeker found, an endless landscape that promised much and delivered little. Indigenous peoples who either could not or would not reveal the locations of golden cities, and a gradually diminishing column of men who succumbed one by one to the accumulated hardships of the journey. By the time Federmann finally emerged from the wilderness, he had lost the majority of his expedition. Those who survived were broken in health and spirit, their dreams of wealth replaced by the simple desire to see civilization again before they died. Federmann's route had taken him to the highlands of Colombia, and there he encountered something unexpected. He was not the only European to have reached this region. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, the Spanish conquistador who had conquered the Muisca, was already there, having arrived from the north. And approaching from the south was Sebastian de Belalcazar, another Spanish commander who had marched up from Peru. 3 expeditions, launched from 3 different directions, had converged on the same spot, all of them seeking the same thing. It was a remarkable coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence at all. The rumors of Muisca wealth had spread in all directions, and all paths led eventually to the source of those rumors. The 3 commanders faced a delicate situation. Each of them had claims to the territory. Each of them had surviving soldiers who expected rewards for their suffering. And each of them knew that conflict between European forces in a land where indigenous peoples vastly outnumbered the invaders could be catastrophic for all parties. After tense negotiations, they agreed to return to Spain together and let the imperial court decide who had the rightful claim to the newly conquered lands. Fetterman made the journey, argued his case, and died before the matter was resolved, worn out by the years of hardship he had endured in the American wilderness. The Welser enterprise in Venezuela continued for another decade after Fetterman's departure. It had never achieved the success its backers had hoped for. Governor after governor was sent out, and governor after governor failed to find the wealth that would justify the investment. The expeditions grew smaller and more desperate. The violence against indigenous peoples intensified as frustrated commanders took out their disappointment on those who could not fight back. Reports of atrocities filtered back to Spain, where critics of the Welser arrangement used them to argue that German Protestants, many of the Welser agents were suspected of being, should not be trusted with the sacred mission of colonization. The most notorious of these reports concerned a later governor named Philip von Hutten, who led what would be the last major Welser expedition into the interior. Hutten departed in 1541, the same year that Gonzalo Pizarro was beginning his catastrophic journey into the Amazon. Hutton's expedition wandered through the llanos and the forests for years, always chasing rumors, always finding nothing. The indigenous peoples they encountered spoke of a wealthy kingdom called Omagua, somewhere to the south or east or west, always somewhere else. Hutton believed these stories, or needed to believe them, and he led his diminishing band of followers ever deeper into the wilderness. The expedition that had started with hundreds of men was reduced to a handful of survivors by the time Hutton decided to turn back. They had been gone for nearly 5 years. They had found nothing. When they finally staggered back to Venezuela, Hutton discovered that political circumstances had changed. A rival Spanish faction had seized control of the colony, and they viewed the returning Germans as enemies rather than fellow colonists. Hutton and his second-in-command were ambushed and murdered by the Spanish governor, their heads displayed as trophies of a political victory that had nothing to do with El Dorado and everything to do with the brutal realities of colonial power. The Welser family's involvement in Venezuela ended shortly thereafter. Charles V revoked their charter in 1546, citing mismanagement, failure to meet colonial obligations, and the endless stream of complaints about violence and misrule. The great banking experiment in conquest was over. The Welsers had spent enormous sums and lost numerous agents and countless indigenous lives, and they had nothing to show for it but debts and recriminations. The territory they had tried to exploit passed into Spanish hands, where it would remain for the next 3 centuries. The German chapter of the El Dorado story is rarely told in full, perhaps because it does not fit neatly into the narratives that later generations constructed about the conquest of the Americas. It was not a tale of heroic exploration or religious mission or even straightforward imperial expansion. It was a business venture funded by bankers and staffed by mercenaries, and it failed in the way that business ventures fail, not dramatically, but gradually, as costs mounted and returns failed to materialize. The men who died in the Venezuelan wilderness died not for God or king, but for the balance sheets of a counting house in southern Germany. Yet, the Welser expeditions contributed to the evolution of the El Dorado legend in important ways. Each expedition that failed to find the Golden City pushed the imagined location further into the unknown. If El Dorado was not in the Venezuelan highlands, perhaps it was deeper in the llanos. If it was not in the llanos, perhaps it was beyond the next river, beyond the next mountain range, beyond the limits of what any expedition had yet explored. The legend gained power from its failures as much as from its promises. Every expedition that returned empty-handed was proof not that El Dorado did not exist, but that it was better hidden than anyone had imagined. The German expeditions also demonstrated something important about the nature of the search itself. The Welsers were rational businessmen, not romantic dreamers, calculated costs and benefits, assessed risks, and made decisions based on what they believed would maximize their returns. And yet, they pursued El Dorado with the same obsessive intensity as any wild-eyed conquistador. The legend had a power that transcended individual psychology. It was a cultural force, a shared delusion that could capture minds regardless of their usual modes of thinking. The promise of unlimited wealth, the dream of the one great discovery that would change everything, proved as seductive to German bankers as to Spanish soldiers. The indigenous peoples of Venezuela, meanwhile, had experienced something they could not have anticipated and would not soon forget. They had been invaded, not once, but repeatedly, by foreigners who came from across the sea, seeking something that the land did not contain. They had been enslaved, tortured, killed, and displaced, all in pursuit of a phantom. The disruption to their societies was catastrophic. Communities that had existed for generations were scattered or destroyed. Trade networks that had connected distant regions were severed. Knowledge that had been passed from elders to children was lost when the elders died and the children were taken away. The survivors adapted as best they could. Some fled deeper into the interior, into regions so remote that the Europeans could not follow. Some made accommodations with the new power, learning Spanish, converting to Christianity, finding niches in the colonial economy where they could survive, if not thrive. Some continued to resist, fighting a guerrilla war against the invaders that would continue in various forms for centuries. But none of them ever forgot the violence that had come to their land in search of gold that was not there. As the 16th century progressed, the Wells of Failure joined the growing list of El Dorado expeditions that had found nothing. The Venezuelan route had been tried and had proved fruitless. The Amazon route had been tried and had proved deadly. The Colombian highlands had been conquered, but the gold found there, while substantial, was not the limitless wealth that the legend promised. El Dorado remained unfound, which meant that it remained possible. And, as long as it remained possible, men would continue to seek it. The torch was passing now from one generation to another, and soon it would pass from one nation to another as well. The Spanish had dominated the search for decades, but their dominance was beginning to fade. Other European powers were challenging Spanish supremacy on the seas and in the colonies. Other adventurers were hearing the stories of El Dorado and wondering whether they might succeed where the Spanish had failed. The next great chapter of the search would be written not by conquistadors from Castile, but by Englishmen who had their own reasons for wanting to believe in cities of gold. Among all the expeditions that ventured into the South American wilderness in search of El Dorado, none descended so completely into madness as the journey of Lope de Aguirre. His story is not merely a tale of failed treasure hunting. It is a descent into the darkest regions of the human soul. A chronicle of paranoia, murder, and rebellion that has haunted the imagination of historians and artists for centuries. In Aguirre, the El Dorado obsession found its most terrifying expression. A man who began as a conquistador, seeking gold, and ended as something closer to a demon, leaving a trail of blood across a continent before his inevitable destruction. The expedition that would become Aguirre's theater of horror began in 1560, nearly 2 decades after the Pizarro Relonana disaster had demonstrated the dangers of Amazon exploration. The Spanish colonial authorities in Peru, despite that earlier catastrophe, had not abandoned the dream of finding wealthy kingdoms in the eastern lowlands. Rumors continued to circulate about a land called Amagua, sometimes conflated with El Dorado, sometimes presented as a separate prize, but always described as rich beyond imagination. The Viceroy of Peru, seeking to rid himself of troublesome soldiers who had nothing to do in peacetime but cause problems, authorized an expedition to find and conquer this legendary realm. The man chosen to lead this venture was Pedro de Ursu, a nobleman from Navarre who had built a reputation as a capable military commander. Ursu was young, handsome, and ambitious, everything that a leader of conquistadors should be. He assembled a force of several hundred Spaniards, along with the inevitable contingent of indigenous porters and servants, and prepared to descend the eastern slopes of the Andes and follow the rivers into the unknown. Among the soldiers who joined him was a man named Lope de Aguirre. Aguirre was in his 50s by this time, old for a conquistador, spotty, bearing the scars of decades spent in violent service. He had come to the Americas as a young man and had participated in numerous campaigns, always on the margins, never quite achieving the wealth or status he believed he deserved. He had a reputation for ferocity and for harboring grievances. A man who remembered every slight and nursed every wound until it festered into something dangerous. He walked with a limp, the result of an old injury, and his face was marked by the hardships of a life spent in jungle and mountain warfare. Those who knew him recognized something unstable in his character, capacity for violence that went beyond the ordinary cruelty of the conquest. The expedition departed in late 1560, floating down the rivers that fed into the Amazon system. Almost immediately, problems began to emerge. Ursu had brought with him a woman, Inés de Atienza, with whom he was romantically involved. And this breach of military discipline caused resentment among soldiers who had left their own families behind. The river journey was slow and difficult. The promised kingdom of Omagua failed to materialize, and discontent spread through the ranks like the fevers that were already beginning to thin them. In this atmosphere of frustration and disappointment, conspiracies began to form. Aguirre was at the center of the plotting, though he was careful at first to let others take the lead. The conspirators convinced a young nobleman named Fernando de Guzman to serve as their figurehead, promising him that they would make him king of the territories they would conquer. On New Year's Day, 1561, the conspirators struck. Pedro de Ursu was stabbed to death in his tent, and Fernando de Guzman was proclaimed Prince of Peru and leader of the expedition. The murder of a royal appointee was an act of rebellion against the Spanish crown. And every man who participated knew that there could be no going back. They had made themselves outlaws, and their only hope of survival lay in success. But Aguirre had no intention of sharing power with the weak and indecisive Guzman. Over the following months, as the expedition continued its drift down the river, Aguirre systematically eliminated anyone he perceived as a rival or threat. Guzman was murdered. Other conspirators were killed one by one, often on the flimsiest pretexts. Aguirre conducted trials in which he served as judge, jury, and executioner, finding men guilty of crimes they had not committed and sentencing them to immediate death. The expedition became a floating death camp, its numbers shrinking not only from disease and accident, but from the paranoid purges of its new leader. Aguirre justified his actions with a rhetoric that was equal parts megalomania and genuine grievance. He declared that the King of Spain had abandoned the conquistadors who had won him an empire, that the colonial authorities were corrupt parasites who enriched themselves while those who had done the actual fighting received nothing. There was truth in these complaints. Many conquistadors had indeed been poorly rewarded for their services, and colonial government was often venal and unjust. But Aguirre took these legitimate grievances and transformed them into a manifesto of total rebellion. He renounced his allegiance to King Philip II, declared war on the Spanish Empire, and announced his intention to return to Peru, overthrow the colonial government, and establish himself as ruler of the former Inca domains. The document he sent to Philip II, which somehow survived the chaos of the expedition and made its way back to Spain, remains one of the most extraordinary letters in the history of the conquest. In it, Aguirre addresses the king with a mixture of formal respect and bitter accusation. He details the sufferings of the conquistadors, the injustices they have endured, the ingratitude of a monarch who has benefited from their sacrifices while denying them their just rewards. He describes his own crimes without apology, presenting the murders he has committed as necessary acts of war. And he concludes by informing the king that he, Lope de Aguirre, is now in rebellion, that he will fight the royal forces with whatever strength he possesses, and that he expects no mercy and will give none. The expedition emerged from the river system and reached the island of Margarita, off the coast of Venezuela. Here, in July 1561, Aguirre and his men seized the island, plundering its settlements and adding local recruits to their diminished numbers. From Margarita, Aguirre crossed to the mainland, still proclaiming his intention to march overland to Peru and make war on the empire. The journey that had begun as a search for El Dorado had become something else entirely, a rebellion against the very civilization that had spawned the legend. But Aguirre's rebellion was doomed from the start. He commanded only a few hundred men, many of them held together by fear rather than loyalty. The Spanish colonial authorities, once they understood the nature of the threat, mobilized to destroy him. As Aguirre marched through Venezuela, his army melting away through desertion and death, royal forces closed in from multiple directions. The local population, who might have supported a liberator, found only a tyrant who killed and plundered without discrimination. Aguirre's paranoia intensified as his situation deteriorated. He killed more of his own men, seeing traitors everywhere, trusting no one. In the final days, as royal troops surrounded his last stronghold in the town of Barquisimeto, Aguirre committed his most infamous act. He had brought his teenage daughter with him on the expedition, perhaps the only person for whom he felt any genuine affection, rather than let her fall into the hands of his enemies, where she might be punished for her father's crimes or forced to live with the shame of his memory. Aguirre killed her with his own hands. The accounts differ on the details. Some say he stabbed her, others say he strangled her. All agree that he told her it was an act of mercy, that he was saving her from a fate worse than death. It was the act of a man who had lost all connection to normal human feelings, who had become so consumed by his own darkness that he could murder his child and call it love. When the royal soldiers finally broke through his defenses, Aguirre was still fighting. He was shot multiple times before he fell, and even then, some accounts suggest he continued to struggle until his wounds made movement impossible. His body was dismembered, his head sent to be displayed in an iron cage as a warning to other potential rebels. His followers, who had not already deserted, were captured, tried, and executed. The rebellion was over. The story of Lopita Aguirre became legendary almost immediately. He was the traitor, the madman, the monster who had murdered his own daughter. He was also, for some, a kind of dark hero, a man who had dared to challenge an unjust empire and had paid the ultimate price. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Aguirre was certainly mad in any meaningful sense of the word. His paranoia was pathological, his violence disproportionate even by the bloody standards of his time. But his grievances were real, and his critique of the colonial system, stripped of his murderous expression, contained elements that other voices would echo in the centuries to come. The Aguirre expedition revealed something important about the psychology of the El Dorado search. The men who joined these ventures were not balanced individuals pursuing reasonable goals. They were, many of them, men who had already failed at conventional paths to success and were seeking a last chance at wealth and glory. They were displaced, desperate, and deeply unstable, held together by leaders whose own stability was often questionable. The privations of the jungle, the constant disappointments, the endless deaths from disease and violence, all of these wore down whatever psychological defenses the men might have possessed. Madness was not an aberration in these expeditions. It was almost an inevitable destination. Aguirre simply went further down that road than most. He crossed lines that others stopped short of. Not because he was fundamentally different from his fellow conquistadors, but because he lacked the restraints that kept others in check. He had no family reputation to protect, no hope of returning to a normal life, no residual loyalty to institutions that had never rewarded his service. He was free in a terrible way, free to become exactly what the conquest had always threatened to make of its participants. He was the El Dorado dream turned nightmare, the logical endpoint of a quest that was never really about gold, but about power, violence, and the darkest human impulses dressed in the clothing of glory. The rivers continued to flow after Aguirre was gone, carrying water and sediment toward the distant Atlantic as they had for millions of years before the first conquistador dreamed of golden cities. The jungle reclaimed the sites of his murders. The indigenous peoples who had witnessed his passage added his story to their own histories. Another chapter in the long catastrophe of the conquest. And the legend of El Dorado survived, because legends do not die when the men who pursued them perish. If anything, the horror of Aguirre's expedition added to the mystique of the search. Here was a prize so valuable that men would lose their souls in pursuit of it. The 16th century was drawing toward its close, and El Dorado remained unfound. The Spanish had exhausted themselves in the search, had lost countless lives, and spent fortunes that could have built cities or funded universities. They had conquered real empires, the Aztec and the Inca, and had extracted real wealth, mountains of silver from Potosi and gold from 100 smaller sources. But the ultimate prize, the city of gold that would dwarf all previous discoveries, had eluded them. Perhaps it was time to admit that El Dorado did not exist. But admission of failure is not in the nature of dreams. As the Spanish retreated from their most extravagant fantasies, others were ready to take their place. Across the Atlantic, in the island kingdom of England, a new generation of adventurers was emerging. Men who looked at the Spanish Empire with envy and hostility, who believed that English courage and English luck might succeed where Spanish cruelty had failed. Among them was a courtier, a poet, a soldier, and an adventurer whose name would become forever linked with the El Dorado legend. His name was Walter Raleigh, and he was about to stake everything on a dream of gold. The legend of El Dorado crossed the ocean to England, wrapped in the pages of Spanish chronicles and the whispered reports of sailors who had glimpsed the coasts of South America. By the late 16th century, England was emerging as Spain's great rival, a Protestant nation challenging Catholic supremacy on the seas and in the struggle for colonial empire. English privateers raided Spanish treasure ships. English merchants sought routes to the wealth of the Indies that would bypass Spanish control, and English dreamers read the accounts of conquistador expeditions with a mixture of fascination and calculation, wondering whether the Spanish had simply been looking in the wrong places or using the wrong methods. Among these dreamers, none was more accomplished or more ambitious than Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a man of extraordinary talents and equally extraordinary contradictions. He was a soldier who wrote poetry, a courtier who organized expeditions to the ends of the earth, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth who would die on the executioner's block under her successor. He possessed charm, intelligence, and a gift for self-promotion that made him one of the most famous figures of his age. He was also vain, impulsive, and prone to grandiose schemes that outstripped his resources. In the legend of El Dorado, Raleigh found a cause worthy of his ambitions, a prize that would elevate him above all rivals and secure his place in history. That it would ultimately destroy him was a possibility he either did not consider or chose to ignore. Raleigh's interest in South America developed over many years, fed by intelligence gathered from Spanish prisoners, from English sailors who had explored the region, and from his own voracious reading. He became convinced that the Spanish had made a fundamental error in their search for El Dorado. They had looked in the wrong places, focused on the Andes and the Amazon when the true location of the Golden City lay elsewhere. Raleigh believed that El Dorado, which he called by his indigenous name Manoa, was situated beside a great lake called Parime, somewhere in the interior of what is now Venezuela and Guyana. This lake appeared on maps of the period, a vast body of water that existed only in imagination but was treated as geographical fact. The political circumstances of the 1590s created an opportunity for Raleigh to pursue his obsession. Elizabeth's favor had cooled after his secret marriage to one of her ladies-in-waiting, and he needed a spectacular success to restore his position at court. An expedition to find El Dorado would serve multiple purposes. It would challenge Spanish claims to South America, potentially opening the region to English colonization. It would bring wealth that could finance further ventures, and it would demonstrate Raleigh's value to the crown, proving that he was more than just a courtier, but a man of action, capable of expanding English power into new territories. In 1595, Raleigh sailed from England with a small fleet bound for the Orinoco River and the rumored kingdoms beyond. His expedition was modest compared to the vast columns that Spanish conquistadors had led into the interior. Raleigh had perhaps 100 men carried in ships that were designed for ocean sailing rather than river navigation. He knew that he could not conquer El Dorado by force. His plan was to explore, to gather intelligence, and to establish friendly relations with indigenous peoples who might welcome the English as allies against their Spanish oppressors. If he could prove that El Dorado existed and that it was accessible, he could return with a larger force to claim the prize. The Orinoco received the English expedition with the same indifference it had shown to every previous European venture. The river was vast. Its delta a labyrinth of channels that could confuse even experienced navigators. The climate was brutal, the heat and humidity sapping the strength of men accustomed to English weather. Insects descended in clouds, carrying diseases that would thin the ranks of any expedition that lingered too long. Raleigh pressed forward anyway, transferring his men to smaller boats that could navigate the shallower waters upstream, pushing deeper into a landscape that seemed designed to swallow intruders without trace. The indigenous peoples Raleigh encountered told him what he wanted to hear, or what they thought would make him go away, or what they genuinely believed. It is impossible to know which. They spoke of a great kingdom in the interior, ruled by a powerful chief who possessed gold in quantities beyond counting. They described cities with golden roofs and temples filled with treasure. They pointed toward the mountains and said that the path to these wonders lay in that direction. Raleigh recorded these accounts carefully, interpreting them through the lens of his pre-existing beliefs, seeing confirmation of El Dorado in every story and every rumor. The expedition penetrated perhaps 400 miles up the Orinoco and its tributaries before practical considerations forced a retreat. The rainy season was approaching, which would make the rivers impassable in some places and turn the lowlands into vast swamps in others. Supplies were running low, and the men were weakening from illness and exhaustion. Raleigh had found no golden city, no Lake Perry, no evidence of El Dorado beyond the stories that indigenous peoples had shared. But he had found something else, or believed he had. He had found gold-bearing quartz in the hills above the river, samples of which he collected to bring back to England. And he had found what he believed was the approach to the Golden Kingdom, a route that a better-equipped expedition could follow to the prize that had eluded him. Raleigh returned to England in 1595 and immediately set about turning his limited findings into a case for imperial expansion. He wrote a book, published the following year, with the magnificent title, The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, with the relation of the great and golden city of Manoa, which the Spaniards call El Dorado. The book was part travel narrative, part promotional literature, and part fantasy, blending genuine observations of the landscape and peoples of the Orinoco with extravagant claims about the wealth that awaited future explorers. Raleigh described a kingdom whose ruler was anointed with gold dust, coined the original Muisca legend, and whose capital city contained treasures that would dwarf anything the Spanish had found in Mexico or Peru. The book was a success in terms of capturing public imagination, but a failure in its primary purpose of securing support for a follow-up expedition. Elizabeth was interested, but not convinced. Her advisors questioned the reliability of Raleigh's claims and the feasibility of challenging Spain in South America when resources were needed for conflicts closer to home. The gold samples Raleigh had brought back proved inconclusive. Perhaps genuine gold, or perhaps nothing more than pyrite. The fool's gold that had deceived so many treasure seekers. Years passed, and the second expedition that Raleigh had hoped for remained perpetually out of reach. Elizabeth died in 1603, and her successor, James I, had little use for the adventurers who had flourished under the old queen. Raleigh fell from favor spectacularly, accused of involvement in a plot against the new king and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to imprisonment, and Raleigh spent the next 13 years in the Tower of London, writing history, conducting scientific experiments, and dreaming of the golden city that he had never found. El Dorado became his obsession in a new way, not just a prize to be won, but a redemption to be achieved, the one thing that could restore his freedom and his honor. In 1617, Raleigh finally received permission to attempt a second voyage to the Orinoco. He was 63 years old, worn by imprisonment and illness. But his conviction that El Dorado awaited him had not diminished. The expedition he assembled was larger than his first, carrying perhaps 1,000 men in a fleet of 14 ships, but the terms under which he sailed were impossible. King James, who was pursuing a diplomatic alliance with Spain, had forbidden Raleigh from attacking Spanish settlements or ships. He was to find the gold mine he claimed to have discovered in the interior, extract its wealth peacefully, and return without provoking international incident. It was a mission designed for failure. The voyage was catastrophic from the start. Storms scattered the fleet during the Atlantic crossing. Disease swept through the ships, killing hundreds before they even reached South America. Raleigh himself fell ill and was too weak to lead the expedition up the Orinoco. He sent his men under the command of Lawrence Keimer and accompanied by Raleigh's own son, young Walter, to find the gold mine while he waited with the ships at the river's mouth. The expedition found no mine. What they found instead was the Spanish settlement of Santo Tome, which they attacked in direct violation of the king's orders. In the fighting, young Walter Raleigh was killed. The survivors straggled back to the ships with no gold, no mine, and the body of Raleigh's son. Keimer, facing his commander's grief and accusations of failure, killed himself. Raleigh was left with the ruins of his final expedition and the knowledge that he had violated the conditions of his release. Some of his captains mutinied and sailed away. Others urged him to flee to France or some other refuge beyond the reach of English justice. Raleigh chose instead to return to England, perhaps believing that he could still justify his actions, perhaps too broken to care what happened next. The reception that awaited him was precisely what he should have expected. The Spanish ambassador demanded punishment for the attack on Santo Tome. King James, unwilling to sacrifice his diplomatic goals for a disgraced adventurer, allowed the original death sentence to be carried out. On the morning of October 29, 1618, Walter Raleigh was executed in the Old Palace Yard at Westminster. His final words, reportedly, were a jest about the axe that would end his life. He asked to see the blade, ran his thumb along its edge, and remarked that it was a sharp medicine, but a cure for all diseases. The legend says that he directed the executioner to strike true, and that he died bravely, as he had always believed a gentleman should. Raleigh's pursuit of El Dorado had consumed the last decades of his life and had contributed directly to his death. The golden city he had sought with such conviction did not exist, had never existed, was nothing more than a legend compounded from whisker ritual and conquistador fantasy. The gold mine he had claimed to discover was either a delusion or a deliberate fabrication, a lie told to secure his release from prison. The book he had written, which had done so much to spread the El Dorado legend in the English-speaking world, was a mixture of genuine exploration and wishful thinking, its claims indistinguishable from its inventions. And yet, Raleigh's legacy in the story of El Dorado is complicated. He was not simply a fool, chasing a phantom. He was a man of his time, operating within a framework of assumptions about the world that made El Dorado seem plausible and its pursuit seem reasonable. The Spanish had found real empires and real wealth in the Americas, while should there not be more? The indigenous peoples of the Orinoco region did possess gold, did have complex societies, did tell stories of wealthy kingdoms. That these kingdoms were not El Dorado, were not cities paved with gold, was a distinction that required knowledge no European of the period possessed. Raleigh's expeditions also contributed to the gradual mapping and understanding of South American geography. His descriptions of the Orinoco and its peoples, however embellished, provided information that later explorers would build upon. His vision of an English presence in South America, challenging Spanish monopoly and offering indigenous peoples an alternative to Spanish oppression, would eventually be realized, though not in the way he had imagined. Guyana would become a British colony, and English influence in the region would persist for centuries after Raleigh's bones had turned to dust. The search for El Dorado did not end with Raleigh's execution, but it was never again pursued with the same intensity or on the same scale. The 17th century brought new preoccupations, religious wars in Europe, colonial rivalries in North America, the rise of new economic systems that valued trade over conquest. El Dorado gradually transformed from a destination to be found into a symbol to be contemplated, a metaphor for human striving and human folly. The golden city that had driven men to madness and death became a literary device, appearing in poems and philosophical tales as a representation of the impossible dreams that both inspire and destroy us. But the physical search was not quite finished. While adventurers had given up on finding a city of gold in the jungle, there remained one location where treasure might actually exist. The original El Dorado legend had placed offerings beyond counting. Lake Guatavita still held its secrets beneath the dark surface of its waters, and sooner or later, someone would try to claim them. While conquistadors and adventurers had spent decades searching the jungles and mountains of South America for a city of gold that existed only in imagination, the actual source of the El Dorado legend sat quietly in the Colombian highlands, holding its secrets beneath waters that had remained largely undisturbed for centuries. Lake Guatavita, the sacred site where Miska chieftains had once been covered in gold dust and had made their offerings to the spirits below, became the focus of a different kind of treasure hunt. If El Dorado as a city could not be found, perhaps El Dorado as a lake could be drained. The idea was simple in concept and nightmarish in execution. The lake occupied a nearly circular crater, its waters fed by rainfall and small streams, its depths unknown but presumed to contain the accumulated offerings of generations. If one could lower the water level, the treasures that had sunk into the mud would be revealed. The engineering challenge was formidable. The lake sat at an altitude of over 3,000 meters, surrounded by steep crater walls. There was no natural outlet, no river that could be diverted to empty the basin. Any attempt to drain Guatavita would require either massive pumping operations or the cutting of channels through the crater rim to allow the water to escape. The technology of the 16th and 17th centuries was barely adequate to the task. The first serious attempt to drain Lake Guatavita came remarkably early, within decades of the Spanish conquest of the Muisca. Iiwusiwu, a conquistador named Hernan Perez de Quesada, brother of the more famous Gonzalo, who had led the original conquest, organized an effort to lower the lake's water level using a bucket chain. Hundreds of indigenous laborers working under conditions that can only be imagined passed containers of water from hand to hand up the steep crater walls. The labor was immense, the progress painfully slow, but over the course of several months, the water level dropped by approximately 3 meters. When workers were finally able to wade into the exposed shallows and sift through the mud, they found gold objects, small figurines, and ornaments that confirmed the lake did indeed hold treasure. The total recovered was modest by conquistador standards, perhaps a few thousand pesos worth, but it was enough to prove that more awaited below. The bucket chain method could only accomplish so much. To reach deeper into the lake, would require a more ambitious approach. In the 1580s, a merchant from Bogotá named Antonio de Sepulveda obtained a contract from the Spanish crown to drain Lake Guatavita completely and claimed a percentage of whatever treasure was recovered. Sepulveda's plan was to cut a notch in the crater rim, creating a channel through which the lake water could flow out and down the mountainside. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of thousands and the removal of enormous quantities of rock and earth. Sepulveda invested his fortune and his years in the project. The channel was cut, slowly and at tremendous cost in lives and resources. Indigenous workers died from accidents, from exhaustion, from diseases that spread through the labor camps. The work continued, regardless, driven by Sepulveda's conviction that unimaginable wealth lay beneath the waters. When the channel was finally completed and the water began to flow, the lake level dropped dramatically, perhaps by as much as 20 meters. The exposed lake bed revealed more gold objects, including a staff and an emerald the size of a hen's egg, according to contemporary accounts. But it also revealed a problem that would plague every subsequent drainage attempt. The lake bottom was not hard stone, but deep, soft mud that had accumulated over millennia. The gold objects had sunk into this mud, and extracting them required workers to wade through muck that could swallow a man to his waist or deeper. Sepulveda recovered treasures worth perhaps 12,000 pesos, a substantial sum, but nowhere near enough to cover his expenses. His channel, inadequately engineered, partially collapsed during heavy rains, allowing the lake to refill. He attempted repairs, but lacked the resources to complete them. The project that was supposed to make him wealthy, instead, bankrupted him. He died in poverty, another victim of the El Dorado dream. And the lake he had tried to conquer returned to something like its original state, its secrets still largely intact beneath the dark water. The Spanish colonial period saw several more attempts to drain Guatavita, each meeting with limited success and eventual failure. The pattern was always the same. Investors would be attracted by the promise of treasure, would underestimate the engineering challenges, would recover enough gold to keep hope alive, but not enough to justify the expense, and would eventually abandon the effort when money or willpower ran out. The lake seemed almost to be defending itself, refilling after each drainage attempt, its mud protecting the offerings that had been entrusted to its care. The Muisca, if any remembered the old rituals, might have seen this as evidence that the spirits of the lake were not ready to surrender what they had been given. The centuries passed. Colombia achieved independence from Spain. New technologies emerged that made large-scale drainage projects more feasible, and still the dream of Guatavita's treasure persisted. Passed down through generations of fortune seekers who believed that modern methods might succeed where colonial efforts had failed. In the 19th century, several companies formed with the explicit purpose of draining the lake and recovering its gold. Most of these ventures collapsed before achieving anything substantial. Victims of inadequate financing, political instability, or the sheer difficulty of working at high altitude in a remote location. The most ambitious and in some ways most tragic of these modern attempts came in the early 20th century. A British company called Contractors Limited obtained rights to drain Lake Guatavita and arrived in 1911 with equipment that would have seemed miraculous to Sepulveda and his laborers. They brought steam-powered pumps, modern drilling equipment, and engineers who understood hydrology and soil mechanics. Their plan was to drive a tunnel through the crater wall at the lowest point of the lake bed, allowing the water to drain completely while the tunnel provided access to the treasures below. The work proceeded with industrial efficiency. The tunnel was cut through solid rock, emerging at the bottom of the lake bed. The pumps roared to life, drawing water through the tunnel and out of the crater. Week by week, the lake shrank, revealing a muddy expanse that grew larger as the water retreated. By the time the drainage was complete, Lake Guatavita had been reduced to a muddy puddle at the center of its crater, surrounded by exposed lake bed that represented centuries of accumulated sediment. The treasure hunters prepared to claim their prize. What they discovered was a lesson in the physics of mud. The lake bottom, exposed to the tropical sun for the first time in perhaps thousands of years, began to dry. As it dried, it hardened, transforming from soft sediment into something approaching concrete. The golden objects that lay within this mud became encased in a substance that could not be easily penetrated. Workers with picks and shovels made slow progress, and the items they recovered were disappointingly few. There were gold objects, certainly, including pieces of evident antiquity and craftsmanship, but the quantities were nothing like what the investors had imagined. The protective mud that had frustrated Sepulveda for centuries earlier proved equally effective against modern technology. The company ran out of money before it could properly excavate the lake bed. The equipment was sold off to pay debts. The tunnel they had cut remained open, preventing the lake from ever fully refilling. But the systematic treasure recovery that had been planned never took place. The artifacts that were extracted were sold at auction in London, dispersing the sacred offerings of the Miska across the collections of European and American museums and private collectors. The lake bed, scarred by the drainage attempt, gradually accumulated water again, though it never returned to its original depth. Lake Guatavita today is a shadow of what it once was, its sacred character diminished by the repeated assaults of treasure hunters. The Colombian government eventually recognized that Lake Guatavita was being destroyed by the endless attempts to drain it. In 1965, the lake was declared a protected area, and treasure hunting was officially prohibited. The ban was not always effectively enforced, and illegal excavations continued for years, but the era of large-scale drainage projects was over. What remained of Guatavita's treasure would stay in the mud, protected by law, if not by the spirits that the Miska had once believed dwelt in its depths. The irony of the Guatavita treasure hunts is profound. Spanish and their successors spent centuries and fortunes trying to extract gold from a lake whose offerings were never meant to be recovered. The Miska had given those objects to the spirits, had thrown them into the water as prayers and petitions, as communications with forces beyond the human world. The gold was not treasure in the sense that Europeans understood. It was sacrifice, gift, relationship. To remove it from the lake was not merely to take wealth, but to violate a covenant between humans and the sacred. The treasure hunters could not understand this because their framework had no place for such concepts. Gold was gold, valuable in itself, and it did not matter what meanings others had attached to it. The amounts recovered from Lake Guatavita over all the centuries of effort were significant, but not extraordinary. Estimates vary, but the total value was probably equivalent to a few $1,000,000 in modern currency. A fortune for an individual, but nothing compared to the silver mountains of Potosi or the gold that flowed from other colonial sources. The costs of the recovery efforts almost certainly exceeded the value of what was found. The dream of El Dorado, even in its most literal and localized form, proved to be an illusion. The lake held treasure, yes, but not the limitless wealth that the legend promised. The Golden City had never existed, and even the Golden Lake was more modest than the story suggested. Perhaps the true treasure of Lake Guatavita was never the gold at all. Perhaps it was the ritual itself, the moment when a chieftain covered in gold dust pushed off from the shore and floated toward the center of the sacred water, carrying the prayers of his people to the spirits below. That treasure could not be drained or excavated. It existed in time rather than space, a moment that had passed and could not be recovered, leaving behind only the physical residue of offerings that were never meant to be seen again. The drainage attempt did yield one discovery that would prove more valuable to history than any quantity of gold. In 1969, 3 men exploring a cave near the town of Pasca, south of Bogota, discovered a ceramic vessel that had apparently been hidden in antiquity. Inside the vessel was a golden object that has become the most famous artifact of Muisca civilization, perhaps of all pre-Columbian Colombia, was a model of a raft made of gold, showing a central figure surrounded by smaller attendants, all standing on a vessel that floated on waters that no longer existed. It was, unmistakably, a representation of the El Dorado ceremony itself, created by Muisca craftsmen as an offering, or perhaps as a record of their most sacred ritual. The Muisca raft, as it came to be known, now resides in the Gold Museum in Bogota, where it is the centerpiece of a collection that includes thousands of objects from the indigenous cultures of Colombia. It is small, perhaps only 7 inches long, but its detail is extraordinary. The central figure stands with arms extended, larger than the others, clearly the chieftain who was about to offer himself and his gold to the lake. The attendants carry objects that may be offerings or ceremonial items. The raft itself is rendered with careful attention to construction techniques. Looking at it, one can almost see the real raft pushing off from the shore of Guatavita on some morning before history began. It's carrying its golden passenger toward the center of the sacred water. This single object, found not in the lake, but in a cave, tells us more about the true El Dorado than all the treasure recovered from Guatavita's mud. It shows us that the legend was rooted in reality, that the ceremony the Spanish heard about had actually taken place, that the Muisca had created gold objects of genuine artistry to honor their beliefs. It also shows us what was lost when the conquest came, a civilization capable of works of beauty and meaning that was swept away by invaders who saw only the material value of the gold and nothing of the spirit it embodied. The cave where the raft was found had protected it for centuries, perhaps millennia, keeping it safe from treasure hunters and conquistadors and the endless assaults on indigenous heritage. It emerged into a different world, one where such objects were valued as cultural patrimony rather than mere bullion to be melted down. The Muisca raft is priceless now, not because of the gold it contains, but because of what it represents. A window into a world that the El Dorado seekers destroyed in their quest to possess it. To understand what the Spanish destroyed in their search for El Dorado, we must look beyond the legend and into the reality of the civilization that created it. The Muisca were not a footnote to the conquest. It's not merely the source of a rumor that sent Europeans to their deaths in distant jungles. They were a complex society with achievements in agriculture, trade, astronomy, and metallurgy that rivaled anything in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their understanding of gold, so thoroughly misinterpreted by their conquerors, reflected a worldview of profound sophistication, one in which material wealth was inseparable from spiritual meaning, and the boundaries between human and divine were permeable membranes rather than solid walls. The Muisca homeland lay in the high valleys of the eastern Cordillera of the Andes, in what is now the Cundinamarca and Boyacá departments of Colombia. This was not jungle country, but highland plateau, a landscape of rolling green hills and fertile basins where temperatures remained mild year-round despite the equatorial latitude. The altitude, between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, created a climate that allowed for the cultivation of crops that could not survive in the lowland heat. The Muisca grew maize and potatoes, beans and quinoa, cultivating terraced fields that stepped up the mountainsides like staircases built for giants. They had no beasts of burden, no wheeled vehicles, no iron tools, and yet they fed a population that may have numbered over 1 million at its peak. Their political organization was neither centralized empire nor scattered villages, but something in between, confederation of chiefdoms that maintained their independence while participating in a shared cultural system. The two most powerful chiefs, the Zepa of Bacata and the Zac of Hunza, commanded tribute and allegiance from numerous smaller communities. But they did not exercise the absolute control that the Inca emperor held over his domains. Muisca society was hierarchical, with nobles and priests occupying positions of privilege. But it was also networked, connected by trade routes that brought goods from distant regions and by ritual obligations that bound communities together in webs of reciprocity. Trade was the lifeblood of Muisca civilization. The highlands produced certain goods in abundance, cados and textiles and the products of skilled craftwork, but lacked others that were essential to life and ritual. Salt was perhaps the most important trade commodity. The Muisca controlled salt mines at Zipaquara in Imocan, where they extracted the mineral from underground deposits and processed it into cakes that could be transported and exchanged. Salt was necessary for preserving food, for maintaining health, for the chemical processes of tanning and dyeing. Communities that lacked access to salt deposits depended on Muisca traders to supply this essential substance, and they paid for it with goods the highlands could not produce. Gold came to the Muisca through these same trade networks. The highlands contained no gold deposits of significance. The metal arrived from the lowland rivers to the east and west, where indigenous peoples panned for nuggets and dust in the sediment. It arrived as raw material, unworked yellow metal that carried no meaning until Muisca craftsmen transformed it. The fact that the Muisca were not gold miners, but gold workers, is crucial to understanding their relationship with the metal. They did not think of gold as something to be accumulated in its raw state, as a measure of wealth that could be hoarded or spent. They thought of gold as a medium for transformation, a substance that existed to become something else. The gold working techniques of the Muisca were extraordinary by any standard. They mastered the lost wax casting method, creating molds from beeswax that allowed for intricate detail impossible to achieve through simpler techniques. They understood how to alloy gold with copper to create tambaga, a metal that combined the workability of copper with the luster of gold. They developed depletion gilding, a process by which the copper at the surface of a tumaga object could be removed through the application of plant acids, leaving a layer of pure gold that gleamed as brightly as solid gold while using far less of the precious material. These were not primitive techniques. They represented sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, chemistry, and the physical properties of metals. The objects that Muisca goldsmiths created were primarily tunjos, small Buddha figures that served as offerings to the spirits. These tunjos depicted humans, animals, and supernatural beings rendered in stylized forms that followed established conventions while allowing for individual variation. A tunjo might show a seated figure holding objects that indicated status or occupation. It might depict a warrior with weapons, a priest with ritual implements, a woman with a child. Some tunjos showed composite beings, creatures that combined human and animal features, representatives perhaps of the spirit world that the Muisca believed interpenetrated the world of flesh and breath. The purpose of these objects was not decoration or display. Tunjos were made to be given away, to be cast into lakes or buried in caves or deposited at sacred sites where the spirits could receive them. The act of creation was part of the offering, the skilled labor of the goldsmith, adding value to the raw material of the metal. When a tanjo sank beneath the waters of Lake Guatavita, or was placed in a ceramic vessel and hidden in a mountain cave, it carried with it the intentions of the person who had commissioned it and the skill of the craftsman who had made it. The gold itself was merely the vehicle for this transaction between human and divine. This understanding of gold was incomprehensible to the Spanish. For Europeans, gold was money, the universal medium of exchange that could be melted down and minted into coins that would spend. The same, regardless of what form the metal had previously taken, a tanjo representing a Muisca deity and a tanjo representing a warrior and a simple gold nugget were two Spanish eyes, all the same thing, bullion to be weighed, valued, and shipped back to Spain. The sacred dimension of the metal, the relationships it embodied, the prayers it carried, were invisible to minds trained to see only material value. When the conquistadors melted Muisca goldwork into ingots, they were not merely destroying art, they were erasing an entire system of meaning, silencing conversations between humans and gods that had been conducted for centuries. The Muisca relationship with the sacred extended far beyond gold offerings. Their cosmology was complex and subtle, quoted by deities who controlled the forces of nature and ancestors who continued to influence the living. The sun and moon were powerful beings whose movements governed the agricultural calendar and the timing of rituals. Lakes and mountains were not merely geographical features, but living presences with whom humans maintained ongoing relationships. The mummified bodies of dead chiefs were preserved and consulted on important matters, their wisdom continuing to guide the community long after their biological deaths. Priests played a central role in mediating between the human and spirit worlds. They underwent years of training, learning the rituals, the astronomical observations, the mythology, and the practical skills necessary to maintain cosmic balance. Some priests were associated with specific temples or sacred sites. Others were specialists in divination, reading the future in the patterns of coca leaves or the movements of animals. The El Dorado ceremony itself was a priestly function, the transformation of a new chief into a living offering that demonstrated his fitness to lead and his willingness to give everything for his people. The conquest shattered this world with brutal efficiency. The Spanish arrived in 1537, and within a generation, the Muisca Confederation had been dismantled, its chiefs killed or co-opted, its priests persecuted, its sacred sites desecrated. The population collapsed, not primarily through warfare, but through the epidemics that accompanied European contact: smallpox, measles, typhus, diseases against which indigenous peoples had no immunity swept through the highlands, killing perhaps 70 or 80% of the population within a few decades. The survivors found themselves subject to a colonial system that demanded labor, tribute, and conversion to Christianity, that punished the practice of traditional religion, that treated indigenous culture as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a heritage to be preserved. Some knowledge survived despite the conquest. The Spanish themselves recorded aspects of Muisca culture, often with the intention of better understanding and controlling their subjects. Indigenous informants, some of them willing collaborators and others coerced into cooperation, provided accounts of traditional beliefs and practices that found their way into colonial chronicles. Certain ritual elements were adapted and hidden within the forms of Catholicism, saints taking on attributes of indigenous deities, Christian festivals coinciding with traditional celebrations. The Muisca language, Chibcha, was studied and documented by missionaries who needed to communicate with their converts. But the loss was immense and irreversible. The priestly knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate was not transmitted to new generations. The rituals that had maintained cosmic balance were abandoned or forgotten. The goldsmiths who had created tanjos of such skill and beauty were forced to work for colonial masters who wanted only crucifixes and altar ornaments. The trade networks that had connected the highlands to distant regions were disrupted or destroyed. The Confederation itself ceased to exist as a political entity, its component communities absorbed into the colonial administrative structure. What remains of the Muisca today is fragmentary but precious. The Gold Museum in Bogotá contains tens of thousands of objects from the indigenous cultures of Colombia, the largest collection of pre-Columbian gold work in the world. The Muisca raft stands at its center, the most famous artifact of a civilization that created thousands of equally significant pieces. Other museums around the world hold Muisca tanjos that were sold or stolen during the colonial period and after, scattered remnants of a heritage that was never meant to leave its homeland. The descendants of the Muisca still live in Colombia, though centuries of colonization and intermixing have transformed their communities. In recent decades, there has been a revival of interest in indigenous heritage, an effort to recover languages, rituals, and traditions that were nearly lost. Some communities have reasserted their musical identity, seeking legal recognition and the return of ancestral lands. The sacred lakes, including Guatavita, have been recognized as sites of cultural significance, protected by laws that earlier generations would have welcomed. The El Dorado legend, seen from the Muisca perspective, is a story of tragic misunderstanding, a ceremony that expressed the deepest values of their civilization, the transformation of a leader through the gift of gold. The relationship between human community and sacred lake was interpreted by foreigners as evidence of limitless wealth waiting to be plundered. The gold that was meant to sink forever beneath dark waters, carrying prayers that the spirits would receive, was instead dragged up from the mud and melted into ingots, its meaning destroyed along with its form. The search for El Dorado was, in this light, not merely a futile treasure hunt, but a desecration, an assault on a sacred system by people who could not see what they were destroying. Understanding the Muisca reality does not diminish the power of the El Dorado legend. If anything, it deepens that power by adding layers of meaning that the treasure hunters never grasped. The golden city that drove men to madness and death was always an illusion, a projection of European greed onto American soil. But the golden ritual that inspired the legend was real, and it pointed toward truths about wealth and meaning that the conquistadors could not perceive. The Muisca knew something that their conquerors did not, that gold without meaning is merely metal, that wealth without relationship is merely accumulation, that the treasure worth seeking cannot be found at the bottom of any lake or in the vaults of any city, because it exists in the connections between humans and in the covenant between humans and the sacred. For centuries, the Amazon rainforest was understood by Europeans as a green hell, a vast and trackless wilderness that swallowed expeditions whole and gave nothing back but death and rumors. The conquistadors, who searched for El Dorado in its depths, returned with tales of endless jungle, hostile peoples, and the complete absence of the wealthy cities they had hoped to find. This understanding persisted into the modern era, shaping scientific and popular conceptions of Amazonia as a pristine wilderness, untouched by human civilization, a place where sophisticated societies could never have developed. But in recent decades, its understanding has been revolutionized by discoveries that suggest the El Dorado seekers may have been closer to the truth than anyone imagined. Not because there were cities of gold, but because there were cities. The Amazon basin covers an area larger than Western Europe, a drainage system so vast that it carries roughly 1/5 of all the fresh water that flows into the world's oceans. For most of recorded history, this region was assumed to be sparsely populated, home to scattered tribes who lived in harmony with the forest because the forest could not support anything more complex. The soils of the Amazon are notoriously poor, their nutrients locked in the biomass of the living forest rather than stored in the ground. When the forest is cleared, the thin topsoil is quickly depleted, unable to sustain agriculture for more than a few seasons. How could cities arise in such an environment? How could large populations concentrate when the land itself seemed to forbid it? The first hints that this understanding might be wrong came from the accounts of the early explorers themselves. Francisco de Orellana, during his desperate journey down the Amazon in 1542, reported passing through regions of dense population, villages that stretched for miles along the riverbanks, peoples who attacked his flotilla with fleets of canoes. He described settlements of substantial size, agricultural fields, evidence of political organization far more complex than the scattered tribes that later travelers would encounter. Orellana was dismissed as an exaggerator, a man who inflated his accounts to make his journey seem more significant. Similar dismissals greeted other early reports of Amazon populations. But Orellana was describing something real, something that had already begun to disappear by the time his reports reached European readers. The epidemics that devastated indigenous populations throughout the Americas struck the Amazon with particular ferocity. The dense settlements that Orellana observed were perfect environments for disease transmission. The interconnected trade networks that linked communities across the basin served as highways for pathogens. Within decades of first contact, the populations of the Amazon may have declined by 90% or more. The survivors retreated into the forest, their numbers to diminish to maintain the complex societies their ancestors had built. The cities that Orellana glimpsed were ghosts before any European could study them properly. For centuries, the evidence of these lost civilizations lay hidden beneath the forest canopy. The jungle is relentless in reclaiming what humans build. Wooden structures rot, earthworks erode. Gardens are overgrown by wild vegetation that makes them indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. Archaeological investigation in the Amazon was difficult, expensive, and produced results that seemed to confirm the assumption of sparse population. The few sites that were excavated appeared to be small settlements, unremarkable in their artifacts, consistent with the image of simple forest peoples living in balance with nature. The revolution began with the study of soils. In various parts of the Amazon, researchers discovered patches of dark, fertile earth that differed dramatically from the poor soils that surrounded them. This terra preta, as it was called, was rich in organic matter, in charcoal, in pottery fragments, and other signs of human activity. It was not natural soil, but manufactured soil, created over generations by indigenous peoples who had learned to transform the unproductive earth of the Amazon into something capable of sustaining intensive agriculture. The terra preta sites were not small. Some covered hundreds of hectares, suggesting populations far larger than the scattered tribes that inhabited the region in historical times. The implications were profound. The Amazonian peoples had developed techniques to overcome the limitations of their environment. Then, all assumptions about the region's carrying capacity were wrong. The Amazon could have supported large populations, complex societies, even cities. Those societies had possessed the knowledge to make it possible, and the terra preta proved that at least some societies had possessed that knowledge. The forest peoples were not primitive tribes living in harmony with an unchanged wilderness. They were the descendants of civilizations that had actively shaped their environment, had engineered the very soil they cultivated, had created an anthropogenic landscape that later observers mistook for pristine nature. The next breakthrough came from the sky. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to penetrate forest canopy and map the ground beneath, revealed what human eyes could never see from the surface. When LiDAR surveys were conducted over portions of the Amazon, they showed features that could only be human creations: geometric earthworks, raised roads, circular plazas, the unmistakable signatures of urban planning. These features were not visible from the ground, where the forest had reclaimed them so thoroughly that even local inhabitants were unaware of their existence. But from above, stripped of vegetation by computer processing, they stood out as clearly as the street grids of modern cities. The discoveries multiplied in the southern Amazon near the border of Bolivia and Brazil. LiDAR revealed complexes of interconnected settlements that had housed tens of thousands of people. In the Xingu region, researchers found evidence of planned communities arranged in precise patterns, connected by roads that ran straight through the forest 4 kilometers. Near the mouth of the Amazon, on Marajo Island, enormous earthen mounds indicated societies capable of mobilizing labor on a massive scale. Each discovery pushed back the boundaries of what had been thought possible in the Amazon. Each confirmed that the assumptions of generations of scholars had been wrong. The cities of the Amazon were not built of stone. They were built of earth and wood, materials that the forest provided in abundance and reclaimed with equal efficiency. Their populations were sustained not by the intensive grain agriculture of Old World civilizations, but by forest management strategies that combined cultivation, agroforestry, and the manipulation of wild plant populations. The forest itself was a garden shaped over millennia by human hands to produce the foods and materials that communities needed. When those communities collapsed, the garden reverted to wilderness, but traces of its managed past remained in the distribution of useful species. In the patches of terra preta, in the earthworks that only modern technology could detect, This new understanding cast the El Dorado legend in a different light. The Spanish conquistadors were looking for cities of gold, imagining that the wealthy kingdoms they sought would resemble the Aztec and Inca empires they had already conquered. They did not find what they were looking for because they did not know how to recognize what was actually there. The Amazon did contain complex societies, populations that numbered in the millions, communities that would have seemed impressive to any observer capable of understanding them. But these were not societies that valued gold as the Spanish valued it. Their wealth was measured in food security, in social relationships, in the knowledge that allowed them to thrive in an environment that Europeans found uninhabitable. The expedition of Percy Fawcett represents a strange coda to this story. Fawcett was a British explorer who became obsessed with finding a lost city in the Amazon, a place he called simply Z. He had studied the accounts of early explorers and was convinced that somewhere in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, the ruins of an ancient civilization awaited discovery. Unlike the conquistadors, Fawcett was not motivated primarily by gold. He was seeking evidence of human achievement, proof that sophisticated cultures had flourished in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. In 1925, he set out with his son Jack and a friend named Raleigh Rimmel to find the city of Z. They vanished into the forest and were never seen again. Fawcett's disappearance became a legend in its own right, spawning rescue expeditions, theories, and eventually books and films that kept his story alive in popular imagination. For decades, his quest was seen as romantic but misguided, the pursuit of a fantasy that had no basis in reality. But the discoveries of recent years suggest that Fawcett was more right than wrong. The Amazon did contain lost cities, though not the stone ruins that Fawcett imagined. The civilization he sought had existed, though it had disappeared centuries before he was born. He was searching for something real, but he did not understand its nature. And the forest that had reclaimed the cities long ago reclaimed him as well. The true El Dorado of the Amazon was not a city of gold, but a civilization of earth. It was a world of farmers and engineers who transformed the most challenging environment on the planet into a home for millions of people. It was a world of trade networks and political alliances, of astronomical knowledge and artistic achievement, of religious beliefs and social structures that we are only beginning to understand. This world was destroyed not by a single conquest, but by the invisible army of pathogens that European contact unleashed. The people died, and the forest grew back over everything they had built. And for centuries, the world believed that the Amazon had always been empty. Now we know differently. The LiDAR images and the terra sites and the archaeological excavations have revealed a past that challenges everything we thought we knew about human possibility in the tropics. The conquistadors who searched the Amazon for El Dorado were walking through the ruins of something remarkable, something that in its own way was more impressive than any city of gold. They could not see it because it was already overgrown, because it was not built of the materials they expected, because their minds were fixed on a fantasy that blinded them to the reality beneath their feet. The search for El Dorado in the Amazon has not ended. Modern archaeologists continue to explore the region using technologies that the conquistadors could not have imagined to reveal secrets that the forest has kept for centuries. Each year brings new discoveries, new sites, new evidence of the scale and sophistication of pre-Columbian Amazonian societies. The full picture is still emerging, and it will be decades before we truly understand what was lost when the epidemics swept through and the cities fell silent. But already, we know enough to rewrite the history books. The Amazon was not a wilderness that humans barely touched. It was a landscape that humans shaped for millennia, a garden continent that sustained millions of people before European contact brought it crashing down. The Golden City was a myth, but the cities were real. They were simply not made of gold. They were made of earth and wood and the accumulated knowledge of generations. And they are magnificent in ways that the treasure hunters could never have appreciated. The legend of El Dorado did not remain confined to the mountains and jungles where treasure hunters sought it. Over the centuries, it escaped the bounds of geography and became something larger. A cultural symbol that appeared in literature, philosophy, art, and eventually film. The Golden City that had never existed in South America came to exist everywhere in the imagination of humanity as a representation of dreams, delusions, and the eternal human tendency to believe that somewhere just beyond the horizon lies a place where all desires will be fulfilled. The evolution of El Dorado in culture tells us as much about ourselves as the historical expeditions tell us about the conquistadors who undertook them. The earliest literary treatments of El Dorado drew directly from the chronicles of exploration. Spanish writers compiled accounts of the various expeditions, sometimes celebrating the courage of the participants, sometimes lamenting their failures, always feeding the appetite for stories of adventure in exotic lands. These chronicles circulated throughout Europe in translation, bringing the legend to readers who would never see the Americas but could participate vicariously in the search for its treasures. El Dorado entered the European imagination as a place that might actually be found, a destination on maps that grew more accurate each year, even as the Golden City itself remained perpetually just beyond their edges. The 18th century brought a different kind of engagement with the legend. Voltaire, the French philosopher who used satire to critique the pretensions of his age, included El Dorado as an episode in his novel Candide, published in 1759. His version of the Golden City is a deliberate inversion of everything the conquistadors had sought. Candide and his companions stumble upon El Dorado by accident and find a place where gold and jewels are so common that children play with them in the streets. The inhabitants have no interest in these materials except as convenient toys and paving stones. They live in peace and contentment, needing nothing from the outside world. Puzzled by the idea that anyone would value yellow metal over happiness and wisdom, Voltaire's El Dorado is a philosophical thought experiment, a mirror held up to European greed and violence. The people of his Golden City cannot understand why visitors would want to leave, or why they would burden themselves with gems that have no value in the world outside. When Candide departs, laden with treasure that he believes will make him happy, the reader understands that he has missed the point entirely. The true wealth of El Dorado was never the gold, but the society that had transcended the need for it. Voltaire was using the legend to critique not just the conquistadors, but the entire economic and social system of his own time, in which the pursuit of wealth had become an end in itself, divorced from any consideration of what wealth was actually for. Edgar Allan Poe took the legend in a different direction in his 1849 poem, El Dorado, written in the final year of his life. The poem describes a knight who spends his entire existence searching for the golden land. He grows old in the quest, his strength failing, his hope dimming. When he encounters a pilgrim shadow and asks where El Dorado might be found, the answer he receives is cryptic and haunting. The shadow tells him to ride boldly over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, if he seeks for El Dorado. The poem suggests that El Dorado is not a physical place, but a spiritual destination. Perhaps death itself, perhaps enlightenment, perhaps something that can only be reached by passing through the darkest experiences of human existence. Poe's poem captured something essential about the psychology of the El Dorado quest. The knight who dedicates his life to the search is not simply greedy. He is driven by something deeper, a need for meaning that he believes he will find when he reaches his destination. The tragedy is that the search itself becomes his life, the journey replacing any possible arrival. Whether El Dorado exists or not is almost irrelevant. What matters is the searching, the believing, the refusal to accept that the ordinary world might be enough. Understood that El Dorado was a state of mind as much as a place, and that some people are constitutionally unable to stop seeking it, regardless of the evidence that it cannot be found. The 19th and 20th centuries saw El Dorado appear in countless works of fiction, from adventure novels to science fiction to children's stories. Each generation reinterpreted the legend according to its own concerns and values. Sometimes, El Dorado represented colonial ambition, the belief that Western civilization had the right to seek and exploit the resources of other lands. Sometimes it represented the opposite, a critique of that ambition, a reminder of the destruction that the pursuit of wealth had caused. Sometimes it was simply an exciting setting for tales of exploration and danger, stripped of deeper meaning and reduced to its narrative essentials, a treasure, a quest, obstacles to overcome. The animated film The Road to El Dorado, released in 2000, exemplifies this latter approach. Two Spanish conmen stumble upon the Golden City and are mistaken for gods by its inhabitants. The film plays the premise for comedy and adventure, with little attention to the historical realities of the conquest or the indigenous civilizations that were destroyed by it. El Dorado becomes a theme park version of itself, colorful and entertaining, its gold serving as a plot device rather than a symbol of anything deeper. This is the legend at its most domesticated, rendered safe for family entertainment. Its edges smooth until nothing remains that might disturb or challenge. But other modern treatments have engaged more seriously with the legend's implications. The novel The Lost City of Z by David Grand, published in 2009 and adapted into a film in 2016, uses Percy Fawcett's doomed expedition as a lens through which to examine both the history of Amazon exploration and the scientific discoveries that have revealed the truth about pre-Columbian civilizations. Grand's work is investigative journalism as much as adventure narrative. It's tracing the fate of Fawcett while also exploring the archaeological evidence for the lost cities he sought. The book suggests that Fawcett was not simply a deluded romantic, but a man who intuited something real, even if his understanding of what he was seeking was fundamentally mistaken. The persistence of El Dorado in culture reflects something about the human condition that transcends any particular historical moment. We are creatures who need to believe in possibilities, who find it difficult to accept that the world as we know it is the world as it must be. El Dorado represents the conviction that somewhere things are better, that there exists a place untouched by the compromises and disappointments of ordinary life. This conviction can be inspiring, driving people to explore, to innovate, to refuse the limitations that others accept. It can also be destructive, leading to obsession, exploitation, and the inability to appreciate what is present in pursuit of what is imagined. The psychological dimension of the El Dorado legend deserves particular attention. The conquistadors who searched for the Golden City were not simply rational actors pursuing economic goals. They were men possessed by a vision that had taken on religious intensity. The accounts of their expeditions read like fever dreams, filled with suffering that goes far beyond any reasonable calculation of risk and reward. They watched their companions die by the dozens and pressed forward anyway. They endured starvation, disease, and violence that would have broken most people and still believed that salvation lay just ahead. This is not the behavior of treasure hunters. This is the behavior of pilgrims, of believers, of people in the grip of something that operates at a level deeper than reason. Modern psychology might diagnose the El Dorado obsession as a form of addiction, a pattern of behavior in which the pursuit of a reward becomes more important than the reward itself. The conquistadors experienced moments of hope, small discoveries that seemed to confirm they were on the right track. Just enough reinforcement to keep them going through all the negative experiences that should have driven them home, like gamblers who remember their wins and forget their losses. They filtered their experiences through the lens of their belief, finding evidence for El Dorado in everything and evidence against it in nothing. The El Dorado legend also illuminates the human tendency to project our desires onto unknown spaces. The Americas, before they were mapped and colonized, served as a blank canvas onto which Europeans painted their fantasies. Giants and monsters, fountains of youth, and cities of gold. All the impossible things that the known world had failed to provide might exist in lands that had not yet been explored. As each fantasy was disproven, it simply moved further into the unknown, retreating before the advancing line of exploration, but never quite disappearing. Today, when the Earth has been mapped and surveyed down to the smallest island, we have transferred these projections to outer space, imagining worlds where the treasures we seek might finally be found. The cost of the El Dorado dream extends far beyond the deaths of those who pursued it. The indigenous peoples of South America paid the highest price for European fantasies. Their civilizations destroyed, their populations decimated, their lands claimed by invaders who believed they were entitled to take whatever they found. The gold that was extracted from the Americas transformed the European economy, financing wars and building empires, but it came at a cost measured in millions of lives. The legend of El Dorado is not a harmless fairy tale. It is a story written in blood, a reminder of what happens when one civilization's dreams become another civilization's nightmare. Yet the legend persists, as legends do, because it speaks to needs that do not go away simply because we recognize their dangers. The desire for transformation, for escape, for a world better than the one we inhabit, is woven into the fabric of human consciousness. El Dorado, in its various forms, the physical city, the philosophical ideal, the psychological obsession, represents that desire in its purest expression. We cannot simply dismiss it as foolishness or greed, because to do so would be to deny something fundamental about what it means to be human. We are the species that dreams of golden cities, that believes in better tomorrows, that refuses to accept that this, the world as we find it, is all there is or ever will be. The question that the El Dorado legend poses, and that we have not yet answered, is how to nurture the imaginative capacity that dreams represent while avoiding the destruction that dreams can cause when they become obsessions. How do we seek transformation without trampling those who stand between us and what we seek? How do we hope for better worlds without devaluing the world we have? These are not questions that the conquistadors asked, but they are questions that their example forces us to confront. The golden city they sought was an illusion, but the destruction they caused was real, and we are still living with its consequences 5 centuries later. The mist still rises from Lake Guadavita on cool mornings, just as it did when Muisca chieftains pushed their rafts into sacred waters and offered themselves, covered in gold, to the spirits below. The lake is smaller now, scarred by centuries of drainage attempts, its depths plundered and its sanctity violated. But it remains, and the mist remains, and somewhere beneath the surface, in the mud that has protected so much for so long, offerings still rest that no treasure hunter ever found. The spirits, if they exist, have kept their secrets. We have traveled together through 5 centuries of searching, from the high plateaus of Colombia, where the legend was born, to the depths of the Amazon, where it led men to their deaths. We have followed conquistadors and bankers, madmen and dreamers, each pursuing a vision of golden wealth that retreated before them like a mirage in desert heat. We have watched expeditions set out with hope and return in ruins, watched fortunes spent and lives squandered in pursuit of something that was never there to be found. And now, in these final moments, we must ask what it all meant. What lessons the legend of El Dorado holds for those of us who are still searching for something, even if we do not call it by that name. The most obvious lesson is also the most painful. The search for El Dorado caused suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Indigenous peoples who had lived in the Americas for thousands of years saw their worlds destroyed by invaders who cared nothing for their lives, their beliefs, or their right to exist. The Muisca, whose beautiful ritual inspired the legend, were conquered and converted and reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. The peoples of the Amazon, whose cities the conquistadors walked through without recognizing, were devastated by diseases that turned thriving communities into ghost towns. Millions die so that Europeans could chase a fantasy of unlimited gold, and the survivors were left to build new lives in the wreckage of everything their ancestors had created. This destruction was not incidental to the search for El Dorado. It was inherent in the very concept. The conquistadors believed they were entitled to take whatever they found, that indigenous peoples were obstacles to be overcome, rather than humans to be respected. They tortured captives for information about golden cities. They enslaved entire communities to serve as porters for their expeditions. They viewed the Americas as a treasure chest waiting to be opened, and they could not imagine that anyone might have a legitimate claim to what lay inside. The El Dorado legend gave them permission to do whatever was necessary to find their prize, and what was necessary turned out to be atrocity on a continental scale. We cannot look at this history without acknowledging our own complicity in its consequences. The wealth extracted from the Americas built the modern world, financing the industries and institutions that shaped our present. The gold and silver that flowed from colonial mines became the capital that funded European expansion, that built the cities where we live, that created the economic systems within which we operate. We are the inheritors of the El Dorado quest, whether we chose that inheritance or not, and we bear some responsibility for understanding what it cost and who paid the price. But the lessons of El Dorado are not only about the past. They speak to patterns of thought and behavior that persist into the present, that shape our choices and our futures in ways we do not always recognize. The conviction that wealth lies somewhere else, that we must only find it and take it, continues to drive exploitation of people and places around the world. The belief that material riches will bring happiness, that gold or its modern equivalents will solve all problems and fulfill all desires, remains as powerful and as illusory as it was 5 centuries ago. We have not outgrown the El Dorado dream. We have simply changed its forms. Consider the gold rushes that punctuated the 19th century, drawing prospectors to California and Alaska and Australia in pursuit of sudden wealth. The same fever that drove the conquistadors drove these later seekers. It's the same willingness to endure hardship, the same conviction that fortune awaited those bold enough to pursue it. Most found nothing. Some found enough to keep hoping. A few struck it rich, and their stories became the legends that inspired the next generation of seekers. The pattern repeated. California giving way to the Klondike, giving way to wherever the next rumor of easy wealth originated. Consider the speculative bubbles that have repeatedly seized financial markets, from tulip mania in 17th century Holland to the cryptocurrency frenzies of our own time. The psychology is the same. The belief that a particular asset will only increase in value. The fear of missing out on riches that others are claiming. The willingness to invest more than reason would suggest in pursuit of returns that seem certain until they vanish. The Spanish conquistadors would have recognized this behavior. They knew what it meant to chase a dream of wealth beyond the horizon, to believe that this time would be different, that the treasure was really there. Consider the extraction industries that continue to tear resources from the earth in pursuit of profit, often with devastating consequences for local communities and ecosystems. The mining operations that poison rivers and displace indigenous peoples are the direct descendants of the colonial enterprises that sought gold in the Americas. The logic is unchanged. Wealth exists in the ground, and those who can extract it have the right to do so, regardless of who lives there or what will be left behind. The golden cities we seek today are measured in barrels of oil and tons of ore, but the seeking itself follows patterns laid down when the first conquistador heard whispers of El Dorado. Yet the El Dorado legend also contains within it the seeds of a different understanding, a wisdom that the treasure hunters could not grasp, but that we might still recover. The Mizca knew something that the Spanish did not, that gold is only metal, that its value lies not in itself, but in what we make of it, that the true treasures of human existence cannot be weighed or measured or stored in vaults. When the golden chieftain washed the dust from his body, and let it sink into the sacred lake, K, was demonstrating a truth that the conquistadors spent their lives denying. Wealth that is not given away is not truly possessed. Value that is not shared has no meaning. The gold that disappears into dark water, carrying prayers to spears below, is more valuable than the gold that sits in treasuries, hoarded against needs that will never be satisfied. This indigenous wisdom has echoes in traditions around the world, okay, in religious teachings that warn against the accumulation of material wealth, okay, in philosophical systems that locate happiness in relationships rather than possessions, okay, in the everyday knowledge of people who have learned that money cannot buy the things that matter most. The conquistadors could not hear this wisdom because their ears were stopped with gold fever. They saw the Muska giving away treasure and could only imagine how much more must be hidden somewhere. Could not comprehend that the giving away was the point, was the treasure itself, was what made the gold meaningful rather than merely valuable. The true El Dorado, if we must seek one, is not a place, but a way of being. It is the capacity to find richness in what is present rather than what is absent. To value connection over accumulation, to understand that the pursuit of wealth for its own sake leads nowhere worth going. This El Dorado cannot be found by expeditions into unknown territories or by drainage projects that empty sacred lakes. It can only be found by the transformation of the seeker, by the willingness to question whether what we are chasing is worth the cost of the chase. The golden chieftain underwent such a transformation when he entered the lake covered in gold and emerged covered in water. He gave everything away and received in return the authority to lead, which is to say, to serve. The night deepens now, and the stars wheel overhead as they have wheeled for billions of years, indifferent to the dreams and delusions of the small beings who gaze up at them from this particular planet. The conquistadors saw these same stars as they made camp in unfamiliar jungles, heard the same night sounds, felt the same mixture of fear and hope that has accompanied human beings on every journey into the unknown. They were not monsters. Most of them, they were men shaped by their time and their circumstances, pursuing goals that their culture had taught them to value. That their pursuit caused immense harm does not make them incomprehensible. It makes them human, which is both an explanation and a warning. We are all capable of becoming conquistadors. We're all capable of chasing phantoms so intently that we trample everything in our path. We are all capable of believing that the next horizon will reveal what this one is hidden, that the treasure is real if we only push a little further, sacrifice a little more, refuse to accept that the golden city was never there. The El Dorado legend is not a story about people fundamentally different from ourselves. It is a story about a possibility that lives within every human heart, a possibility that can lead to destruction if it is not tempered by wisdom, compassion, and the capacity for self-reflection. The mist will rise again tomorrow over Lake Guatavita, and the sun will catch its surface and turn it briefly to gold, as it has done every morning since before humans existed to witness it. The offerings beneath the water will remain where they were placed, messages to spirits that may or may not have received them, prayers that may or may not have been answered. The Muisca descendants, who still live in the Colombian highlands, will go about their lives, carrying forward what remains of traditions that survived conquest and colonization. And somewhere, perhaps, a child will hear the story of El Dorado for the first time and feel the stirring of that ancient dream, the conviction that somewhere, somehow, there exists a place of golden wonder waiting to be found. May that child learn, as we all must learn, that the gold is not the point. May they understand that the true treasure lies not in what we take, but in what we give. Not in what we find, but in how we seek. Not in the destination, but in the transformation that the journey makes possible. May they carry the dream without being carried away by it. Appreciate its beauty without being blinded by its glitter. Hear its promise without believing its lies. And may they remember, when the dream grows too strong and the seeking too desperate, that the Golden City was never there, that the jungle claimed every expedition that pursued it, that the only El Dorado worth finding is the one that exists not beyond the horizon, but within the heart. The night is deep now, and sleep draws near. And the story of El Dorado fades into the darkness from which all stories come and to which all stories return. Rest now, knowing that the search is over, that the treasure hunters have laid down their burdens, that the sacred lakes hold their secrets in peace. Dream, if you dream at all, not of golden cities, but of golden moments, the small treasures of daily existence that are so easily overlooked in the pursuit of grander things. And wake tomorrow to a world that needs not more seeking, but more seeing, not more taking, but more giving, not more gold, but more of the wisdom that knows what gold is worth and what it is not. The legend of El Dorado has ended, but the lessons it teaches continue. In every generation, in every human heart, the choice presents itself again, to chase the phantom or to appreciate the real, to seek without end or to find within reach, to believe in cities of gold or to recognize that the only gold that matters is the light that falls on ordinary things and transforms them briefly into something that almost resembles what we have always been looking for. The choice is ours. It has always been ours. And in making it, again and again, we write the next chapter of the story that began when the first human looked at the world and imagined it could be otherwise. Sleep now. The gold will keep. The spirits are patient. And the dawn, when it comes, will gild the waters of ancient lakes with light that costs nothing and is freely given to all who are present to receive it.